A report on the Weather Channel last night noted that there were about 50 wildfires burning across the western United States, including one burning out of control near Yosemite National Park in California. Even though I grew up in California, where brush fire season is just as much a part of life as hurricane season is in Florida, when I watched the video of that fire, I couldn't help but be struck by the intensity of the flames and the inability of the firefighters to do anything about them. Flames shooting up 100 feet, fueled by dry grass and trees and fanned by howling winds, would roar up and over the hillsides, consuming everything in their path and leaving only behind charred embers and barren landscape. Within just a few weeks of these fires, however, maybe even within days and while the embers are still smoking, something is going to happen. The forest will come back to life, beginning again its cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. Pine and fir cones dropped by the old trees will have been literally exploded by the heat and pressure generated by the fire, and those seeds will be scattered to germinate and take root in the nutrient-rich ash of what was there before. The all-consuming fire is essential to new growth and the rebirth of the forest. Fire not only cleanses the forest of old growth, it is necessary to forge the steel of the firefighter's axe and his shovel. In a process remarkably unchanged over the centuries, the smelter uses intense heat to separate iron from ore and remove impurities that would weaken the steel. The dross floats to the top and is skimmed off until the smelter can see his own face reflected in the shiny, molten liquid. More intense heat is then used to further purify, harden, and forge the steel. We generally learn about fire at a pretty early age. Most of us, I'm sure, I know I did, would look somewhat in awe at that little flame on the end of a match or a candlestick. We would pass our finger through the flame, and if we were quick enough, we wouldn't even feel the heat. I remember the inevitable contest that I would have every year with my big sister at Thanksgiving and Christmas dinners to see which one of us could move our finger through the candle flame the slowest, which one of us could endure the heat without getting burned. The original hearers of the letter to the Hebrews knew that fire was nothing to be messed around with. That letter, which is really more of an extended sermon, relies heavily on the Old Testament for its imagery about God. And this causes many scholars to believe that the letter's intended audience were people of Jewish origin, not pagans. As people of the book, they would have understood and been familiar with the reference from the Hebrew scriptures describing God as a consuming or a devouring fire. This particular description comes from the book of Deuteronomy, where just before the Israelites crossed the Jordan into the Promised Land, they are warned, "Be careful not to forget the covenant that the Lord your God made with you, and not to make for yourselves an idol in the form of anything that the Lord your God has forbidden you. For the Lord your God is a devouring fire, a jealous God." Like the Israelites who melted down gold and made idols to carry around, we have plenty of idols in our own lives. Anything, in fact, can become an idol when we allow it to take the place of God in our lives. It may not be as obvious as a golden calf, but an automobile, a house, a hobby, a politician or celebrity, any of these things can become idols. Our addictions and our pleasures can become idols when they fill up our lives so that they don't leave any room for God. But the worst idol we create for ourselves is ourselves. We regularly put together false selves that we hide behind and use to impress others and even try to impress God. Our false selves are made up of all of the excuses and rationalizations we make about ourselves to justify that persistent refusal we all have to experience the fullness of God's love, and which then in turn keeps us from loving God and our neighbors with all our hearts and with all our souls and with all our minds. It is in this idol of our false selves that all the other idols are forged. All the things that we treasure more than the love of God. The problem with the idols of our false selves is not just that they're false idols, or that there's something we've created in our own vanity. The problem is that the idols of our false selves are fleeting. They're unreliable. The physical things that we put in the way of God are just that. They're physical, earthly things. They get old, they get rusty, they fall apart. Over time, we grow weary of our hobbies. Maybe our politics change. The people we admire, especially the politicians and the celebrities, are themselves only human and will eventually disappoint us. Our tastes change, and the things that once gave us pleasure now only bore us. So we make new idols. We continually try to recreate our false selves to satisfy our earthly needs. We continue to make excuses and rationalizations for why we're just fine as we are and don't need God. All of these idols are what the author of Hebrews tells us are created things, earthly things, all of which will be shaken once and for all by the voice of God. Instead of these created things, the writer assures us, God has a kingdom for us which cannot be shaken, a kingdom in our hearts and souls where the love of God will replace all of the idols of our false selves. But first, we must clear away the old growth and dense underbrush of our hearts and souls. We must experience the purifying fire of God's love. It is only God's consuming love that can burn away our false selves. When we allow ourselves to be utterly known and embraced by the God who made us and knows us the best, our false selves will turn to ashes, and we will discover that the harshest judgment of God's consuming fire is better than all of our love and all of our love of ourselves. Our hearts and our souls will then be purified like gold and silver and be made ready by the fiery love of God for new growth so that we may continually worship God with reverence and awe. The 19th century Scottish preacher George MacDonald wrote, "We have received a kingdom that cannot be moved, whose nature is immovable. Let us have grace to serve the consuming fire, our God, with divine fear. Not with the fear that cringes and craves, but with the bowing down of all thoughts, all delights, all loves before him who is the life of them all and will have them all pure. It is the nature of God, so terribly pure that it destroys all that is not pure as fire, which demands like purity in our worship. He will have purity. It is not that the fire will burn us if we do not worship thus, but that the fire will burn us until we worship thus. Yea, we'll go on burning within us after all that is foreign to it has yielded to its force, no longer with pain and consuming, but as the highest consciousness of life, the presence of God." Don't be afraid to get burned. Don't be afraid of the fire. God's fire is hot, but it purifies our souls and makes them new. Amen.